Hello, thank you so much for attending. Good morning from California. It's 9 a.m. my time, but I gather later in Israel. So thank you for staying up late or after what might be a long work day or getting up early if you're in California. So let me share my screen. So today I'm going to be talking about a section of my book that came out earlier in this year. The book is called The Sultan's Communists, Moroccan Jews and the Politics of Belonging. That book came out with Stanford University Press. And I'll be talking about a chapter from that book. The chapter title is different from the talk title. The talk title I have is Divided Dreams, Moroccan Jews and the Post-Independence Moroccan State. As you can see from this title slide, I am the Neufeld-Levin Chair of Holocaust Studies and Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So I'm going to be speaking for about an hour, and I look forward to your questions at the end. I think, as Doron mentioned, you can type your questions to him as they come up during the conversation, or you can save them till the end. But I look forward to hearing what you all have to say about this work by the end. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in. There are two quotes that I'd like you to keep in mind during this talk. The first is from King Hassan II of Morocco, and the second is from Edmond Amran el-Maleh in his 1983 novel, Aylan ou la nuit du récit. So the first goes, "My father, may God keep his soul, always told me, quote, Morocco is a lion that must be guided with a leash. It must never feel the chain. When it pulls too much, I let go a little. And when it lets up, I pull a little. It's a constant compromise, collective and unconscious. We are immersed in the same bath, a bath of love and a bath of conflict. This relationship transforms into perfect solidarity when the nation is in danger," end quote. Second one, psst, psst. In the nocturnal silence, the deserted street of the former Mellah being the Jewish quarter in Morocco, psst, psst. The prostitutes call out to a dawdling client, psst, psst. Here and in all the mythical places, the Zionist streetwalkers point out the great myths set the sky and earth ablaze, uprooted the ancient tree, precipitated men and women to the edge of the end of times. During the bloody uprising of March 1965 in Casablanca, Moroccan Jewish communist leader Simon Levy was arrested by the police. He was tortured for 8 days while his wife, Encarnacion, was stricken with anxiety. She had no idea where her husband was, but feared the worst. She waited at home with their 2 children until, finally, Simon was unceremoniously dumped at the doorstep of their building, broken and bruised. Simon's mother implored the family to go to France, but Simon was adamantly opposed. The Hungarian Communist Party, in a gesture of kindness toward their sympathizers abroad, paid for the family to tour several Soviet domains and for Simon to heal in the spa town of Siofek. Notably, Encarnacion hated the food. The 1960s and 70s proved a crucible for state formation in newly independent Morocco. Simultaneously, these decades mark the height of Moroccan Jewish emigration. The post-independent state, achieved in 1956, was dominated by the monarchy, led by Hassan II after his father's death in 1961. The state experimented with the balance of parliament, constitutional monarchy, state of emergency, and back again, often resulting in violent and repressive outcomes. Political parties splintered, recombined, and challenged each other, as well as central authority in a manner that was deeply disturbing to the palace. The main efforts of the palace were, to quote Hassan II, to guide the lion that was the state without it feeling the guiding hand of the makhzen, the term for Morocco's centralized state authorities, and so quell, control, and ultimately co-opt any political opposition. In the absence of willing political collaborators, the state tortured, exiled, imprisoned, and, quote, disappeared unruly political forces during the period of Moroccan political history known as the Years of Lead. Some parties, such as Istiklal, the mainstream Islamist Moroccan National Liberation Party, and the Moroccan Communist Party, which I henceforth refer to as the PCM after the French acronym, fractured from these reprisals, splitting the most devoted of leftist nationalist Jews in turn. At the same time, Morocco's Jews continued to leave in record numbers, a process that began with Israel's formation as a modern nation state in 1948 and accelerated through the 1950s and 1960s. Most Moroccan Jews left for Israel, but many also migrated to France and Canada. This was in part due to internal anxieties and threats of violence, as well as economic boycotting, linked to the faraway and yet deeply consequential Israeli-Arab conflict. The wave of Jews leaving Morocco accelerated in the 1960s for many reasons, largely to do with economic incentives, kinship ties, and security concerns. As the Arab-Israeli conflict intersected with Cold War politics, Moroccan Jewish members of the Communist Party found themselves increasingly alienated from the broader Moroccan Jewish community. Devoted to communism in its many guises during the 1960s and 1970s, Moroccan Jewish leftists were ideologically consistent with their positions of previous decades, to the point of alienation from their Jewish families and friends. Today, I will be talking about Moroccan Jewish leftist attempts to reconcile Jewish and Moroccan identities within an increasingly murky Moroccan political context. Jewish members of leftist parties remain staunchly devoted to their Moroccanness and their hopes for their country in the face of massive Jewish migration and political repression. I will first explore political splits in the mainstream Moroccan political parties and the Makhzen's ability to control or co-opt them before 1967. Second, I will examine Zionism, clandestine migration, and Hassan II's complicated relationship to Israel within a Cold War context. Third, I will address the break between the Communist Party and the foundation of a far left party, Ila al-Amam, or Forward in Arabic. Jewish leftists in response to the 1967 Six-Day War and the migration of Moroccan Jews to Israel. Fourth and finally, I will juxtapose the fates of the Communist Party and its Jewish leaders, Simon Levy, Abraham Serfati, and Edmond Amran el-Maleh, within the Moroccan national political narrative. This is a story about failed hopes, accommodations, migrations, and collaborations. It is also about persistence. After Simon Levy and his family returned from healing in Hungary, the activist family returned to its previous activities. Their stories are at once exceptional and emblematic, shedding light on Morocco's political history and that of its Jews in the relief available from the margins. In short, I argue that despite the overwhelming evidence that Jewish life in Morocco was increasingly precarious, Moroccan Jewish communists remain ideologically firm, even firmer than before, agitating for a Morocco that could be, rather than the reality of the Morocco that surrounded them. The Moroccan-Algerian border war of 1963, in addition to prominent leftist populist leader Mehdi Ben Barka's growing influence and calls for third world solidarity, increasingly threatened the palace's legitimacy. As Ben Barka's rhetoric became more revolutionary, the palace began instigating arrests and violent suppression of the main national labor union, the National Union of Populist Forces, or UNFP, and its supporters. 200 UNFP members were put on trial in 1963 to 1964. The Moroccan National Students Union, or UNEM, which had close ties to the UNFP, went on strike, even calling for the abolition of the regime. It was UNEM that spearheaded the March 1965 uprising in response to legislation that would place age limits on high school students, forcing non-traditional high school age students to receive a technical vocational education. Simon Levy joined this fracas, working closely with UNEM and student unions across the Casablancan high school network. A teacher at the prestigious Mohammed V High School in Casablanca, he organized student Marxist circles and wrote for and distributed La Nouvelle Garde, the New Guard, keeping student concerns at the forefront. This joint communist UNEM press campaign served to prime a young, politically frustrated and motivated student population, imploring the government to make good on its pre-independence promises. Through La Nouvelle Garde, Simon Levy and others, including fellow Jewish communist Edmond Amran el-Maleh, whom you can see with Simon Levy. Simon Levy is on the left-hand side, Edmond Amran el-Maleh is on the right-hand side. This is from a Moroccan documentary. Cultivated students' entry into a leftist discourse that would bear fruit in subsequent years. UNEM members and sympathizers interpreted the regime's position as an outrage in the face of widespread illiteracy in the country, since education had been a cornerstone of every national liberation platform. It is estimated that 70% of the Moroccan population was illiterate upon independence in 1956. Casablancan students went on strike on March 22nd, 1965. The next day, the protests turned to riots from all dissatisfied segments of Moroccan society, including parents who were asking for the release of their imprisoned children, unemployed, demanding work, students looking for scholarships, and others simply venting their anger. The rioting spread to every major Moroccan city and lasted for several days. Following the palace's bloody suppression of the uprising, the constitution, faulty as it was suspended, and the king inaugurated a state of emergency. Press censorship, already high, shot up, and at least 14 leftists, many affiliated with the UNFP, were condemned to death on March 27. King Hassan II addressed the Moroccan people 2 days later, on March 29, and sharply criticized the, quote, intellectuals of the left who encouraged such protesting. Famously, he said, "So why didn't they go out into the streets," meaning the intellectuals? "So why didn't they go out into the streets instead of the students? Where is their bravery, their courage, their common sense? Allow me to inform you that there is nothing so dangerous to the state as a so-called intellectual. It would be better if you were illiterate." In the subsequent years, the palace tightened its grip on all state institutions, increased surveillance, arrests, and imprisonment. The national movement weakened and fractured into ever more competing factions, undirected as to how or whether they could work within the state's limitations. The number of victims of the violence is still unknown, although beginning in the early 2000s, the Makhzen began taking more public stock of such events. According to the opposition, hundreds were killed and more than 3,000 arrested, with many victims buried in the night in secret during the Casablanca riots, inaugurating the era known as the Years of Lead. The Communist Party struggled to maintain ideological unity in this context. The party had been put on trial in 1959 and formally banned by court order in 1960. It resurfaced as the PLS, the Party for Liberation and Socialism, with the same structures, membership, and leadership as the PCM. The party was increasingly controlled by the Makhzen. Ali Yatta, the party's secretary general, and others in the party leadership, including Simon Levy and Abraham Sarfati, as well as many other Jews, also remained. At the same time, the communist world was realigning. Since the 1955 Bandung Conference and the growth of the non-aligned movement, international political jockeying among Cold War rivals intensified. De-Stalinization of the USSR and an ascendant Chinese Communist Party challenged the international leftist status quo as Maoism became increasingly popular. This was reflected in the new Marxist-Leninist Moroccan political parties of the late 1960s and early 1970s, the 23 Mars movement, March 23rd, named after the date of the 1965 protests, and Abraham Sarfati's newly formed Illa LMM. Members of each saw the Communist Party as having bent to the Makhzen, having become delegitimized and defanged. Of course, for those who remained in the party, such as Simon Levy, The best opportunity to effect change was through working legally, publicly, and not underground. Meanwhile, as the king attended non-aligned summits and hosted Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, he also courted American intelligence to thwart the threat of leftist movements in his country in the name of Cold War camaraderie. Further, the king clandestinely corresponded with Zionist leaders and agents, often facilitating Jewish emigration while publicly condemning Zionism to preserve national legitimacy. Events in the Levant and Egypt exacerbated the ongoing debate on Moroccan identity and Jewishness, extending from the interwar period through independence. Moroccan political debate and nationalist activism increasingly conflated Judaism and Jewish identity with Zionism and criticism of the actions of the State of Israel. This was despite official political platforms and statements issued by the palace and every major political party. As of King Mohammed V's visit to New York in late 1957, Moroccan Jews were allowed free circulation and passport access, as long as such travel, quote, would not benefit the Zionist enemy, unquote. This liberty of circulation didn't last, however, and Zionist organizing of Moroccan Jewry continued despite Jewish popular devotion to the nationalist cause during the initial and post-independence years. Jewish educational institutions now established much stronger Arabic language education in their curricula, adhering to the demands and ideologies of the post-independence goals. However, the international context of pan-Arabism and Zionism rendered such efforts relatively impotent. January 1961 was a particularly tense month for Moroccan Jews due to three critical events. First, the Egyptian pan-Arabist president Gamal Abdel Nasser visited Casablanca in the context of Morocco hosting an African regional summit. The police, quote, out of excessive zeal, end quote, penalized and threatened the Moroccan Jews of Casablanca, resulting in arrests and violence. Leading members of the World Jewish Congress took note, referencing the, quote, convulsive course of Moroccan developments in 1961, end quote, as a catalyst for Jewish immigration. The Communist Party and certain prominent members of the Casablancan Jewish community loudly decried the anti-Semitic violence during Nasser's visit in a tract entitled, quote, No to Zionism, No to Anti-Semitism, end quote, and condemned Nasser's inflammatory remarks. Quote, the context in which these arrests occurred was outside of any judicial authority, as well as the authorities' silence on the matter concerning police activity and the brutality experienced by some of the arrested children, has aroused profound concern among our Jewish compatriots, end quote. The tract went on to decry Zionist exploitation of the event. André Azoulay, special advisor to the current King Mohammed VI, whose reign has lasted from 1999 to the present, and his father, King Hassan II, whose reign lasted between 1961 and 1999, also experienced persecution during this period as a result of Nasser's visit. Born in Essaouira in 1941, Azoulay had been politically active from a young age and had even flirted with communism. He was a member of the party from 1961 to 1963. He met Ali Yatta, Secretary General of the PCM, in 1958, after he, quote, climbed over the walls, end quote, of his high school in El Jadida in order to hear Yatta speak alongside Neufeld-Levin. During the Casablanca summit, Azoulay worked for the newspaper Moroccan, reporting on the events in Nasser's speech. While reporting on the summit, he became a victim of police repression against Jews. Police officers arrested Azoulay and ripped apart his press pass in front of the newspaper employees as public punishment for the, quote, arrogance of a Jew writing about Nasser and the Arab summit, end quote. Azoulay exemplifies just one case of anti-Jewish activity in this period, and he was active in national liberation and opposed to Zionism. Several prominent intellectual Jews, mostly on the left, including Abraham Serfati, Edmond Amran and Maleh, and Simon-Levy, quote, proclaimed the right of Moroccan Jews to the Moroccan nation. They condemned Zionism as well as the anti-Jewish blunders that sought to deny the right to emigrate, end quote. This document decried anti-Semitic statements in the Moroccan nationalist press, notably Al-Fajr and Al-Ummal, and denounced the harsh police action against Moroccan Jews during Nasser's visit. The tone of this document is imploring. It is not addressed particularly to Moroccan Jews, but to the Moroccan public at large. Quote, "We, the undersigned Moroccan Jews, publicly and unequivocally condemn Zionist propaganda as an instrument of imperialism and as a weapon of division used against the entirety of the Moroccan people. We rise to action against the Zionist agents who, speculating on the deep hopes of Moroccan Jews for dignity, well-being, and security, push the latter to expatriate themselves, while Muslims and Jews must unite their efforts to achieve national liberation and to create in their country conditions for a good life, guaranteeing democracy, well-being, and security for all. Anxious to defend our country against all calumny, we denounce the international campaign against Morocco led by imperialist hypocrites who are trying to recreate a racist climate here in order to discredit our country and tear away the Jewish population from the national community. We declare that, on strictly patriotic grounds, we will fight against all discrimination concerning the rights and freedoms of citizens, persuaded as we are that this country is ours and that no one will be able to deprive us of it." The paper Al-Tahrir seized upon this document and reprinted it, written and signed by 30 supporters of the 30 Jewish supporters of the UNFP and the Moroccan Communist Party. Among these signatories were Simon Levy, Abraham Sarfati, and Edmond Amran and Male. At the same time, Israeli Foreign Minister Golda Meir painted a picture in stark contrast with that of the Moroccan Jewish leftists. Where they decried Zionism as a primary cause of Jewish trouble in Morocco, Meir saw Nasser's visit and the sinking of the illegal Moroccan Jewish migration ship Pisces in January 1961, the second major event of the month, as hallmarks of Moroccan anti-Semitism to be rectified by immigration. For example, Meir stated in the Knesset in the wake of the Pisces sinking, quote, "The Jews are driven into the corner of despair given the discriminatory atmosphere and persecution which presently reigns in Morocco," end quote. Newspapers such as Al-Tahrir and Al-Fajr argued that the mass exodus of Moroccan Jews was enabled by the state under pressure from Israeli, American, and European governments, and were guilty of undermining the cause of Palestine. The newspaper of the Communist Party, Al-Mukafih, had presciently published an article just weeks prior to the sinking of the Pisces entitled, quote, "On the Departure of Moroccan Jews." Actually, it says of Jewish Moroccans, on the departure of Jewish Moroccans. In it, the undisclosed author argued that French planes and perhaps even Royal Air Maroc, the national airline, were transporting Moroccan Jews to Marseille, who from there would travel on to Israel. The article bluntly accused the Makhzen of helping the World Jewish Congress, WJC, and Zionist agents' activities in the country. It cited, albeit skeptically, a rumor on the street that, quote, "the Moroccan government would allow the emigration of Moroccan Jews in exchange for American wheat," end quote. That rumor continues to live today in Moroccan public consciousness. Jean Levy, Simon Levy's son, when generously allowing me access to his father's personal papers, mentioned the rumor, maintaining that UNFP activists had scrawled on walls across Casablanca, "Hassan al-Qara, Baya al-Yahud Bizra." Hassan the Bald, King Hassan II, who indeed was bald, has sold the Jews for wheat, end quote. In the third major event of 1961, Prime Minister Abdallah Ibrahim pushed Morocco into the Arab Postal Union, which resulted in the immediate cessation of postal communication with Israel. The year 1961 counted at least 11,478 illegal immigrants. 1962 to 1963 combined for 72,632. Most of the elite, well-educated Jews remained, but they were the distinct minority. Just a few short years after the ebullient optimism of independence, the mainstream Istiqlal, Independence in Arabic, party, and other political parties began to publish increasingly anti-Semitic tracts, catching Jews in the crosshairs of political activity despite their official protection by the king. Istiklal electoral slogans in 1961 stated, quote, "To vote for a Jew is to betray the country," in an edition of Al-Alam. Quote, "Even the word Jew should be forbidden in Morocco," end quote. Alel El-Fassi, the Istiklal leader turned Minister of Islamic Affairs, declared before Parliament in 1966, quote, "Morocco is a Jewish state. It is led by Jews and foreigners," end quote. In the same period, some Jews, children and particularly women, were kidnapped and forcibly converted to Islam. The main Jewish Moroccan newspaper, La Voix des Communautés, published the photos of the kidnapped and demanded an end to this. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the infamous counterfeit publication, were published and distributed. The Istiklal press called for the rooting out of all Zionists, and Al-Akhbar al-Dunya proclaimed that, quote, "A Jew is a Jew, even if he's been Muslim for 40 years," end quote. Enraged, prominent communist Jewish activist Abraham Serfati responded in a letter to the editor, quote, "Does the editor suggest substituting a concept of nationality based only on religion for the Moroccan concept of nationality deeply rooted in our country?" He received no reply. For a time, restrictions on movement were eased, but Morocco's political agendas at home and internationally were not always in sync, to the detriment of Morocco's Jews. Articles in La Voix des Communautés attempted, somewhat vainly, to convince Moroccan Jews that their place was not in Israel, but in Morocco. The elite minority proclaimed the Moroccanness of Jews above all, but this was not persuasive to the majority. Moroccan Jews, having long been pulled in many countervailing directions, were funneled increasingly into one, out. This does not mean that Moroccan Jewry was ideologically unified. It is important to remember that leaving Morocco did not necessarily mean embracing Zionism or Gallicism. Most often, it meant following one's family, friends, job opportunities, or hopes of improved quality of life. For stalwart Moroccan communist Jews, however, remaining in Morocco was the only politically viable, ideologically consistent option. Migration was exacerbated by Israel's victory during the 1967 Six-Day War. In the aftermath of the war, Jewish businesses were boycotted, public Jewish political support diminished, and the slippage between Jew and Zionist became ever more common. The UMT, a prominent national labor union, publicly called for boycotting Jewish businesses and Jews in the liberal professions, lawyers, doctors, and architects. Mahjoub Ben Sedek, leader of the UMT, addressed a telegram to the king accusing him of, quote, "protecting Zionists and their acolytes, the Jews of Morocco, Zionists dressed in jalabas," and a jalaba is the sort of long cloak with a hood, very common in Morocco. The king defended Moroccan Jewry and urged Moroccans to distinguish between loyal Moroccan Jewish subjects and Zionists, but reminded his Moroccan Jewish subjects in 1967, quote, "The government of His Majesty the King reminds Moroccans of the Jewish faith that their rights as enshrined in the Constitution are completely contradictory with any support or aid they might provide Zionism. Consequently, the government won't hesitate to apply, in all its rigor, the law against those who have been convinced to collude with Zionism, and reminds you that such collusion will lead to the stripping of one's nationality. The state alone has the ability to assure public order and protect the rights of all nations. It will not tolerate any kind of provocation and will not permit anyone taking justice into their own hands," end quote. In 1961, 162,420 Jews remained in the country. By 1967, that number was down to 53,000. The ensuing boycotts and newspaper declarations against, quote, "Zionist citadels" in and out of Morocco made Jewish life in Morocco ever more tenuous. Jewish members of the Communist Party issued a public declaration following the Six-Day War, urging, perhaps in a political vacuum, this Moroccan Jewish community to cease their support of Zionist activities. The tract was repetitive of so many others issued by Jewish communists. It criticized Israel as an imperialist enterprise, chastised Moroccan Jews for not engaging more in the country's political and social climate, and implored Muslims not to conflate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. They reflected, quote, "We, the undersigned, consider Morocco to be our one and only country. Inspired by this intangible principle in our behavior as active citizens, consider it our duty to express our point of view as Moroccan Jewish patriots, imbued with democratic ideals. We deny Zionism the right to decide the politics of global Judaism, to declare itself the representative and defender of our interests. Far from helping resolve the Jewish question, as it claims, Zionism has, on the contrary, gravely compromised the future of Jews in the world. We remain convinced that in this critical hour, when Morocco needs all its children, the duty of every enlightened Moroccan Jew is to maintain solidarity in any way possible with their people, to fight the ideology and politics of Zionism rooted in the communities of the Jewish minority in order to instill within them a complete national consciousness," end quote. After the 1967 war, King Hassan II stated, quote, "The Jew has fulfilled all his obligations toward Arabism and Islam, but the sentiments of the population have unfortunately been exploited by some elements whose only concern is to sow confusion and disorder and to brand Jews with treacherous slogans," end quote. Indeed, Hassan II himself maintained close ties with Israel and the Moroccan Jews of Israel, working with the Jewish Agency to, at times, facilitate Zionist efforts to bring Moroccan Jewry to Israel. Meanwhile, the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, operated offices in Rabat, and a memorandum from the World Jewish Congress in October 1970 noted that taxes from movie tickets and tobacco products went to supporting the organization. The king pursued one policy outwardly and another clandestinely. Israeli officials and their liaisons in the World Jewish Congress and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS, an American Jewish organization established in the 19th century to aid Russian Jewish refugees that operated across the world, were cautiously optimistic about the king. As Mr. R. Spanian of the HIAS visited Morocco, Mr. R. Spanian of the HIAS visited Morocco in the summer of 1964 and concluded that Jewish life in the country was precarious at best, as, quote, "The king and his government are always friendly to the Jews, but how long will the regime last? They seem to live just for the present, and the present is secure. Emigration is satisfactory and may reach this year 12,000. The total Jewish population being under 90,000, the percentage of emigration is very high. Those responsible for the various forms of emigration know that the important thing is to get out the greatest numbers as quickly as possible, lest the situation changes for the worst," end quote. The report cited that the demographic composition of immigrants had shifted from the poor, largely Arabic speakers to more middle-class and elite French speakers dressed in, quote, "European clothes." Meanwhile, WJC and Jewish Agency reports continued to facilitate migration while exaggerating the perceived existential threat faced by Moroccan Jews for partisan political advantage. Edmond Amran Mali once said, quote, "I often think that I'm the only existing Moroccan Jew. There are a few of us who think this way, Serfati, Simon Levy. We swim in antonyms, in contradictions, an absence of physical presence on the land, and at the same time, the permanence of something," end quote. In the final portion of this talk, I will now turn to the intertwining and diverging stories of Abraham Serfati Edmond Amran and Ballet, and Simone Levy, all prominent Moroccan communist Jews and reflective of mid-century Moroccan Jewish political trends. During the 1940s, political options available to Moroccan Jews had narrowed to Zionism, Alliancism, which I'm happy to explain further in the Q&A, and migration to France or communism. In the post-war periods, prevailing options for Jews loyal to the left were exile to France, integrationism via a legal political party, or rejection of the regime. The lives of Serfati and Maleh and Levy represent these post-independence narrative threads and Moroccan Jewish political avenues. Here you have a piece of political propaganda in favor of the release of Abraham Serfati, a prominent political prisoner from the early 1990s. And it says, in the country where the sun is king, women and men disappear in the shadow of the kingdom. Hassan II, King of Morocco, detains the longest serving political prisoner in the world since the liberation of Nelson Mandela, Abraham Serfati. And this was a committee devoted to liberating Abraham Serfati from prison. I'll discuss how he was in prison in just a moment. The late 1960s proved a major rupture between leftist movements and their relationship to the government. Before forming LeFtists, Serfati, a lifelong activist in the PCM since the 1940s, had resigned his prestigious office post at the Office of Sharifian Phosphates out of solidarity with the miners at Khoribga in 1968. 2 years later, he would co-found LeFtists along with the prominent poet Abdelatif Labi. Defectors from the Communist Party to LeFtists hoped to create, quote, a tribunal that surpassed the religious tensions of the era, a tribunal anchored in the continuity of a nationalism in which Moroccans, Muslims, and Jews together would work together against French colonial policy, end quote. Labi and Serfati were both arrested in 1972 and released pursuant to loud UNEM protest. Their freedom did not last long, and both were arrested again shortly thereafter. Labi was caught, but Serfati managed to evade capture for 2 more years by hiding in his wife's apartment, which seems like an obvious place to search, but nonetheless, he was able to hide there. At a trial in Casablanca on July 31st, 1973, Serfati was tried and condemned to life in prison in absentia, alongside Labi and others from UNEM, LeFtists, and 23 Mars. Notably, the UNFP and the Communist Party maintained silence on the affair. In November 1974, Serfati was caught and arrested alongside other notables across the opposition movements. About 120 militants altogether were arrested in this particular cull. Serfati and many others were first detained at the infamous torture and prison center of Derb Moulay Sharif in Casablanca, where they were savagely tortured. The official verdict finally came on Valentine's Day, 1977, years after the initial arrest, torture, and solitary confinement at Derb Moulay Sharif. Serfati and several others were condemned to life in prison. The condemned spontaneously sang the Song of the Partisans in Arabic. Many were subsequently transferred to the Kenitra prison to serve their life sentences. Many, including Serfati, would not exit what Susan Gilson Miller has called the, quote, Golgotha of Moroccan prisons during the years of lead for nearly 2 decades. Serfati would become ultimately one of the most celebrated of Morocco's political prisoners. In 1969, as Serfati was just about to leave the Communist Party and found LeFtists, he wrote on the matter of Jewish flight from Morocco in a special issue of Soufla, a literary journal he co-founded with Abdelatif Labi, devoted to Palestine. He opened the piece, quote, I will be asked, I have been asked, why should anyone continue to be concerned with Moroccan Jewry today? Let this community dwindle down with emigration. The last holdouts will no longer pose a problem, end quote. His essay is historical in scope. addressing the tropes of a slow Moroccan Jewish deracination at the hands of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, a French Jewish educational philanthropy that endorsed the Mission Civilisatrice, or civilizing mission, sponsored by France through a Jewish emancipation prism, colonial policy, and Zionism. The motivations for the essay, in Serfati's words, were, quote, "We would like to summarize this process of 100 years of uprooting in order to share our conviction, a conviction that has only grown stronger with the study of documents past and present, that this mystification will inevitably become known, that Jews from the Arab world, prisoners of Zionism, will gain consciousness of their solidarity with the Arab Revolution and will help to shatter the last historical attempt to lock Jews up in a ghetto. And what a ghetto, of global proportions," end quote. Despite growing ideological differences, Serfati had profound respect for the militancy of his fellow Moroccan Jewish communists. He admired Simon Levy's work with the labor unions and the student unions, in particular recognizing Levy's 1965 arrest and torture, from which he barely survived. Speaking in a we of solidarity with Levy and Moroccan Jewish leftists as a group, Serfati reflected upon 1965, quote, "The Makhzen cannot and has not tolerated us having a citizen's voice. There was the model that Jews shouldn't be heard, except for the court Jews that served it, the Makhzen. A Jew in the political opposition, that's unimaginable. Simon Levy was this opposition in the Communist Party. He was accepted, but the authorities, le pouvoir, tortured him near to death in 1965. This was no accident," end quote. Serfati seems to have accepted Levy as an ideological rival. They disagreed fundamentally about how to work with or against the government, as well as the question of Western Sahara, which I'm happy to talk about more extensively in the Q&A. But he put himself in the same contextual identity of a, quote, "Jew who does politics," to quote Alma. Serfati was freed from prison in 1991, but expelled on the grounds that he was a Brazilian citizen. He spearheaded Moroccan human rights efforts from afar and ultimately returned as a national hero with regime change in 1999. His son, who had also been captured and tortured in the 1980s as a form of governmental revenge, today lives in Casablanca. Ibrahim Serfati died in 2010 and is buried in the Ben Sikh cemetery in Casablanca. A pariah of the Jewish community, his funeral was publicized and attended by government ministers in a striking turn of public opinion. Here is a photo of Edmond Amran and Mele toward the end of his life, with a quote from him in the Moroccan Communist Party journal Espoir, or Hope, in December 1949, in which he wrote, "We are Moroccans," the we being Jews. "We are Moroccans. We are not, quote, foreigners, as the Zionists would have us believe. We are deeply Moroccan," end quote. While Edmond Amran and Mele, one of the earliest Jewish members of the Moroccan Communist Party, never directly addressed the exact catalyst for his leaving the party, Serfati had a few thoughts. Serfati suggests that Al-Maleh was, quote, pushed out of the party in 1958, likely for ideological reasons. Serfati and Al-Maleh both objected to the party's almost religious devotion to Stalinism. While Serfati's solution was to become a political pariah and co-found an extreme left anti-government Maoist movement and land in prison with a life sentence, tortured and often in solitary confinement, Al-Maleh chose exile and a complete break. After leaving the party in 1958, Al-Maleh continued teaching at Casablanca's prestigious Lycée Mohammed V alongside Simon Levy. He left Morocco in 1965 in direct response to the bloody riots of March of that year. In self-imposed exile in Paris, he taught at the Saint-Barbe School while also working as a journalist, not publishing his first novel until 1980. Melancholy, disappointment, and a palimpsestic historical consciousness of the longue durée of Moroccan Jewish history pervade El-Maleh's work. Ultimately, he too was lionized as a Moroccan Jewish hero alongside Serfati and Levy in Moroccan public consciousness and human rights discourse. His work is fundamentally, profoundly regretful in tone. El-Maleh, too, returned to Morocco toward the end of his life, welcomed as a national hero and celebrity for his writing. Today, he has a public foundation and a library in his name in Rabat, just next door to the National Archives. He died in November 2010, the same month as Serfati. He is buried in Essaouira. Simon Levy's trajectory was one of persistence with the legal operations of the Communist Party in Morocco. It was also a trajectory of persistent activism within the Jewish community until his death in 2011. Levy's strategy within the Communist Party was one of commitment to the Moroccan state apparatus, including the monarchy, choosing to work within legal parameters instead of rejecting them. He continued to work closely with the Politburo of the party and was one of the leaders of the National Education Federation from 1958 to 1970. From 1976 to 1983, he served in an advisory capacity on the Municipal Council of Casablanca, where he worked to create local libraries and professional training centers. A professor of linguistics at the Faculty of Letters in Rabat and specialist of Hispanophone dialects, Levy contributed important scholarly works to the study of Moroccan language and literature, in addition to his political activism and legacy. Following the death of the Communist Party's long-serving Secretary General, Ali Yatta, Levy ran for the post but lost. Toward the end of his life, he poured his energy into one of his most lasting legacies in the country. Morocco is famous for having one of the only official Jewish museums in the Arab world. Under Levy's direction, the museum has worked to restore a number of synagogues across the country. Most recently, his own childhood synagogue in Fez, the Stateet, restoration completed after his death with the help of the German government. The opening ceremony of the restored synagogue in 2014 featured Moroccan ministers, Jewish communal luminaries, members of the Moroccan Jewish diaspora, and above all, one of Simon Levy's sons, Jean Levy, who was instrumental in the restoration process, whom you see pictured here. When I asked Simon Levy, in May 2010, how he felt about the fading of the Moroccan Jewish community, he insisted, quote, "I am not nostalgic because I am active." Indeed, end quote. Indeed, when several Jewish sites in Casablanca were bombed in May of 2003, Simon Levy visited schools, Jewish and non-Jewish, around Casablanca, and a public outreach program to bring awareness of the shared Muslim and Jewish history in Morocco. His funeral, like Serfati's, was a public, media-covered affair with government officials in attendance, including André Azoulay, the guy I mentioned earlier who had his press pass torn up during Nasser's visit in 1961. Like Serfati, very few Jews attended his funeral. Levy's wife, Encarnacion, recounted this to me in January 2014 with great resentment. Encarnacion, too, recently passed away in February 2015. Her funeral, also in the Ben Masik Jewish Cemetery, was attended by members of the Communist Party Old Guard, who praised her activism. Each of these Moroccan Jewish leftists worked for another, possible Morocco, that seemed increasingly at odds with the world around them. This is from Edmond Amran. This quote is from Edmond Amran and Maleh's Aylen ou la nuit du récit, a 1983 novel. Quote, "You wait 100 years, 1,000 years. You are stuck in the honey of the past like a stubborn fly. You are bogged down by an incurable nostalgia. You give birth to an imaginary country, suckled by fantasies, obsessive desires, obstinately blind to the present, you wander within yourself, along the ramparts of the Scala, facing the sea, captivated, fascinated by it. You are enthralled by the astonishing marriage of the city and the ocean, a dead city, embalmed, intact in its past, end quote. These lines, written by El from Paris in 1983, conjure the author's depressing vision of a failed promise for Moroccan independence. El protagonist no longer lives in the country, but some aspect of him is, quote, stuck like some, quote, stubborn fly, seduced by a past nostalgia and sweet vision of Morocco in a country that never quite came to fruition. Today, I have argued that the 1960s and 1970s were a critical period for Moroccan post-independence, state reinforcement and development, as well as a tremendous demographic shift. During this time, the Moroccan left fractured into different strategies, trying to cope with an increasingly strong, oppressive state power. The Communist Party opted for the existence as a defanged, if legal, opposition. Il LMM and 23 Mars chose a more radically revolutionary path. Meanwhile, the vast majority of Moroccan Jews left for Israel, France, and Canada. Jews and leftist movements found themselves increasingly alienated and isolated from the prevailing attitudes and concerns of the majority Moroccan Jewish community. Leftist Jewish calls for solidarity against Zionism and anti-Semitism within the country seem to have fallen largely on deaf ears. They represented a minority of a minority, drowned out by much louder and more plentiful voices. But they remain integral to the public national memory and modern Moroccan memory, as well as modern Jewish history. Unlike El-Maleh's stubborn fly stuck in the sweet honey of a fictional past, a fictional city, the Jewish leftist voices presented in this talk disrupt honeyed nationalist, triumphalist narratives, whether Moroccan, Zionist, or internationalist. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Lynn asked, is there any evidence that the mass migration to Israel was in part instigated by the Mossad or other Israeli entities?
Other Israeli entities, yes. The Mossad directly, no. So if you're curious about this question, I highly recommend you read my book on the topic more largely. It discusses a lot of these topics in greater depth than I was able to present in a relatively, I know it's a kind of long talk, but at the same time it's relatively short given the material. But yes, there is evidence certainly of the Jewish Agency, of the World Jewish Congress, of different Zionist organizations working with the Moroccan government at times to facilitate outmigration. It depends on the decade. So it was that sort of Moroccan work with the Israeli, with different Israeli entities. That didn't really start until the late 60s, 70s. It continued in the 80s, but this was very clandestine. The king did not want to be observed for domestic political reasons of legitimacy, did not want to be observed publicly working with any Zionist or Israeli organizations, but that did take place.
Thank you very much. Michael asked, didn't the period immediately following the Six-Day War also see a rise in anti-Semitism in Soviet bloc nations, most noticeably in Poland?
You're asking me about what happened in Soviet bloc nations instead of Morocco?
That's the question.
Okay. Yes, so that did take place in Soviet bloc nations too. And I recommend reading, for example, Paul Hannebrink has a great book. I'm blanking on the title at the moment. It's a great title too. It's a great book. But look up Paul Hannebrink. He writes extensively on what happens in Soviet domains in Eastern Europe in the 1960s and 70s. It's a book largely about the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy and Jews in communist parties in Eastern Europe. But my work is primarily about Morocco and Jews in North Africa and the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Michael also asked, what was the photo taken alongside the seacoast depicting?
Photo along the seacoast. Was there a photo along the seacoast? Photo along the seacoast. Oh, yes, I see what you're talking about. Yeah, that's a photo depicting Moroccan Jewish migrants. Waiting, yeah, that's a picture of Moroccan Jewish migrants. I'm not sure whether I think they're waylaid in Gibraltar, actually, in that photo specifically, but they've left Morocco.
Thank you. Michael asked, what were Tsarfati's ties to Brazil?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked that. It's one of my favorite weird oddities of this history. Abraham Sarfati himself never set foot in Brazil. He was not, in fact, a citizen of Brazil. This was a pretext that the Moroccan government used to expel him. The French government, during the struggle for national liberation, had also used this idea to expel him, as well as his sister, who was also a prominent Moroccan Jewish communist, Evelyn Sarfati. They used this idea of them as Brazilian citizens to expel them. The reasoning behind that Brazilian idea was that Sarfati's father actually had been part of a wave of northern Moroccan Jews that had worked temporarily in Brazil on the hinge of the late 19th and the early 20th century. So there was a wave of migration of Jews from northern Morocco, working particularly in the Amazon as middlemen in the rubber trade industry. So because of the father having done some work in Brazil, both the French colonial government used that as an excuse to boot out these kind of troublesome communist Jews, and then the Moroccan government did the same thing in the early 1990s. And if you want to read more on that topic, there isn't a tremendous amount published on it. It's something that I'm interested in pursuing in a future book project. But Susan Gilson Miller has published an article. She published an article called, I think it's called Kippur on the Amazon. If anybody emails me, you can find my email by Googling me. I'm happy to send references on any of these topics.
Thank you very much. I am going to open microphones. I didn't mention there are many thanks and grateful people from all over the world thanking you in the chat room. I'll send you the transcript. If anyone has any further questions, you are welcome to ask them now that I'm going to open microphones. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you all for being here from all over the world. Laila Tov from Jerusalem. Good night from Jerusalem.
Thank you so much.
Could you say something about the status of Jews in the other Maghreb countries during this period?
Sure. Yeah, there's a rich history in so many different places. And again, if anybody's curious to read more on these topics, I'm happy to send book recommendations. But you're absolutely right. It's a very variegated history of Jews across the Middle East and North Africa. And I'll tackle just the second half of the 20th century. But I'll take it back a little further in the 19th century. There are different colonial interests across the region of North Africa and the Middle East, primarily British and French colonial interests across the region. Of course, with Italy having dominion over Libya starting in 1911. Morocco goes to France in 1912. Tunisia goes to France in 1881. Algeria, of course, is the first to fall in 1830, becoming an integral part of France. Iraq became a British protectorate after the First World War, right? A lot of the Ottoman lands were carved up by colonial powers after the First World War and were taken over primarily by France and by Britain as mandates. And so Jews lived in all of these different areas and were subject to different kinds of colonial regimes and different kinds of legal regimes. And those legal regimes determined in large part how those Jews lived alongside Muslims or Christians or European colonials. In the second half of the 20th century, I mean, the Second World War is a major turning point for Jewish history around the world, but also in the Middle East and North Africa. It's another research interest of mine. And the Second World War really accelerated a lot of pre-existing political trends across the region, whether it was support for Zionism, whether it was support for local nationalisms, whether it was assimilation to, or an attempted assimilation or acculturation to different colonial regimes. So the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 really inaugurated a period. Again, this is a big generalization across a pretty wide region, but the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 inaugurated a trend of conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, right? Assuming all Jews in the countries of the Middle East and North Africa were supporters of the State of Israel. And the reason that that took place and was deeply problematic, I mean, it's problematic for a number of different reasons, but Arab nationalist leaders across the region supported Palestinian nationhood, and Palestinian nationalism was a key component of Arab nationalisms and localized nationalisms across the region. So support of Palestine was kind of a litmus test for national regime legitimacy. That was one of the reasons why the Moroccan king didn't want to be seen working with any Jewish immigration officials or any Israeli authorities until much later, until like the last year, right? That's only taken place openly in the last year, even though it went on clandestinely for several decades. It's a huge topic. I teach a whole class about this, so I'm trying to distill it in just a couple of minutes. One of the standout things that takes place is Algerian Jews, quite differently from other Jews in the regions, were actually made French citizens in 1870 by dint of something called the Crémieux Decree. And they were quote unquote repatriated to France in 1962 at the end of French colonial rule in Algeria. So they were treated as French citizens despite not having set foot in France. This is complicated by a history during the Second World War, in which Jews of Algeria were stripped of their French citizenship by the anti-Semitic Vichy regime, that I'm also happy to talk extensively about some other time. It's a major research area of mine. So we see this complicated relationship to the French nation for Algerian Jews, in the 20th century. French citizenship was not extended to Moroccan or Tunisian Jews. But anyway, it's a complex history of migration, the conflation of Zionism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism, migration identities with Arab nationalist parties or not. So it's a very complicated and nationally specific question that I've already droned on long enough about it. It's a huge topic, so I'm happy to talk further some other time on that topic if you're curious.
Okay, one quick follow-up. Were there very many Jews in the Spanish-speaking parts of Morocco?
Yes, there were a large number of Jews, yeah. So in northern Morocco, so Tangier, Tetuan, Orakche, several other cities in northern Morocco, Spanish-speaking areas. Yes, there were large numbers of Jews there. And that raises an important point that Jews in Morocco were themselves very diverse. There's no such thing as a single Moroccan Jewish identity, just as there's no single American Jewish identity or Israeli Jewish identity. So in the north, it was primarily Sephardi Jews, those Jews who claim their descent from 1492, from the expulsion of Jews from Spain. They spoke Haketia, which is kind of like Ladino, a form of Judeo-Spanish. There were already pre-existing Arab Jews in Morocco before the arrival of the Sephardi migrants. There were also Amazigh or Berber Jews in the region, speaking different languages, living in different segments of Morocco. But yes, there was a very rich Jewish history and culture, still is, northern Morocco of Spanish-speaking Jews.
Okay, and a quick follow-up. How were they treated by the Franco authorities during the period when he was still running things in Spain?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll direct you to the work of Isabel Rohr and Eric Calderwood. They both have written on this extensively, as have others. So it depends on when in the Franco era you mean. I suspect you're talking about the Second World War or maybe the Spanish Civil War period. Which one is that what you have in mind?
Well, sure, from that period right up until the death of Franco.
Okay, so all the sweep of it.
Right.
So it really depends on the time period. As you might know, during the Spanish Civil War, Franco bandied around these sort of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory, right? Indulged in the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory, according to which Jews were responsible for the Russian Revolution, Jews were responsible for communism worldwide, or Freemasonry, all sorts of nefarious schemes. So Franco was a proponent of this. And interestingly, he recruited large numbers of Moroccan Muslims from northern Morocco. So Morocco itself was divided into two protectorates in 1912, a French zone and a Spanish zone. Franco himself got his start militarily in northern Morocco and achieved prominence during the Rif War, which is a war in the 1920s, a rebellion against Spain. Incidentally, Franco recruited Moroccan Muslims to fight against the Spanish Republicans during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. Based on this kind of assumption, it was an assumed hatred that Muslims had for Jews, even though there was no real evidence of that. They tried to pitch recruitment calls saying, hey, you hate Jews, we hate Jews. You hate communists, we hate communists, because communism is supposed to undermine Islam. So why don't you join us in the fight against Jews and communism in Spain? That's the propaganda that went out. There's no evidence that was really taken up, or very little evidence that was really taken up among Muslims. But there were moments of violence against Jews in northern Morocco, in Spanish Morocco as well, at different intervals. And there's a particular history of nationalism, Moroccan nationalism in Morocco in the northern zone that's a little different from in the French zone. And for that, I recommend you read David Skenner's book on the history of the Moroccan nationalist movement, as well as other books. Are there any other questions? I can keep going on this. I mean, one interesting thing that comes up in the news relatively recently, right? You maybe heard about Western Sahara.
Right.
Yeah, and how Morocco laid claim to Western Sahara in something called the Green March in 1975.
Right.
Moroccan Jews on the whole supported the Green March and supported Morocco's claims to Western Sahara, and that was true of Moroccan Jews both in Morocco and those living in Israel or Canada or France or elsewhere. Simon-Levy, who I talked about, was a major supporter of the Green March and was very proud to be among the first to set foot in Western Sahara as part of the march. That territory of Western Sahara had been Spanish since before the Protectorate treaties. And when Franco died in 1975, and there was a kind of gentleman's agreement between Franco and the Moroccan monarchs that the issue of Western Sahara wouldn't come up after independence. But as Franco was ailing, King Hassan II started to agitate further about Western Sahara. He claimed to have a dream in which he would take back Western Sahara from Morocco and in the name of Islam. And so it's a violent struggle that continues to this day, with different moments of peace and flare-ups. Algeria supports an independence group, the Polisario in Western Sahara. Abraham Serfati supported the Polisario, rejected Morocco's claims to Western Sahara, and that was one of the major reasons for which he was a political prisoner from the 70s through the 80s. That was one of the primary reasons he was so penalized, so harshly penalized, was his support for the Polisario Front, in stark opposition to the vast majority of the Moroccan Jewish community that saw support of Morocco's claims to Western Sahara as an opportunity to demonstrate their loyalty to the Moroccan king and their loyalty to the Moroccan nation. So that's an interesting story combined with the demise of Franco.
Right. Mauritania also laid claim for a while to parts of the Spanish Sahara, but I think they backed off on those.
They did, yeah, they did, but they did for a little bit. Yes, they did, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you all very, very much for being with us this evening. Thank you again, Professor Heckman. Laila Tov from Jerusalem.
Thank you all so much for attending and for your questions.
Yeah, thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.